Well, thank you all very much for coming. And I'm going to start with an apology. I want to apologise that we've left this so late. We should have done this 3 years ago, because this is the most important thing that you need to know, or certainly one of the 3 most important things that you need to know. So I do apologise for that. But some of you may have attended a session that we had in 2012 on security, when we had a nice policeman come along. Do you remember that? So this is the sort of follow-up to that. These are the really fundamental basics of why we're here, really. And to understand fully about collections care, it's an enormous area. It's not something that I can cover very effectively in an hour, but I'll concentrate on the bits that you need to know about. Care of collections is really a science. It combines physics, chemistry, biology, engineering, maths, a lot of common sense, and also a willingness to compromise, because the science tells us what the ideals are and reality tells us what is actually practical, bearing in mind all the other things that we need to consider. So I thought we should start by going back to the most basic of basics and asking, what is a museum for? I will start by looking at the sort of international definition of a museum. This was one that was issued or reissued by the International Council of Museums in 2007. A museum is a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study and enjoyment. You notice I've put conserves in big, bold red letters. That is one of the main half-dozen functions of a museum. It's to look after old stuff, or interesting stuff, or beautiful stuff. The Museums Association, that's the British sort of professional organisation for people who work in museums, has perhaps a slightly fuzzier definition. Museums enable people to explore collections for inspiration, learning and enjoyment. So they start with people first. They are institutions that collect, safeguard and make accessible artefacts and specimens, which they hold in trust for society. So we hold in trust all the things that the museum owns, and quite literally in this case, because effectively the owners, both of the things in the museum and of the building containing them, are of course our trustees. Well, when Sir William and his sister Barbara founded the museum, one of the reasons they did it was because William had accumulated all these lovely things, but he realised that he couldn't take them with him. And very often this is how things come to museums. They're things that people have loved that they can't take with them into the next world, and so they pass them on for future generations to enjoy. And their hope is that future generations will enjoy them indefinitely, forever. Which, if you think about it, is completely nuts, because nothing lasts forever. Organic materials are supposed to break down. As Joseph Wright showed us, no creature can escape death. So things rot, they fall to bits, they are attacked by other organisms, and they gradually dissolve into their component elements. There's nothing scary about that, it's perfectly normal. Inorganic materials also don't last forever. So, again, as Wright realised, mountains are not solid and everlasting. Mountains can suddenly explode in your face and spew all over the place and create new mini mountains, new rocks are being formed all the time, and the old rocks are constantly being worn away. So even inorganic materials like stone and metal, they corrode, they wear out, and not even they last forever, but they do last much longer. So a piece of marble is going to last considerably longer than, say, an apple. Some things do last for thousands and thousands of years. This is a lovely Book of the Dead manuscript, one of many in the British Museum. And this would be, about 3,500 years old. It is made of strips of reeds that are adhered together, and then it's been painted on with pigments from various organic and inorganic sources. The reason that this has lasted so long, we all know, it's because it's been locked up in a tomb with no daylight, very well sealed from oxygen and pollutants, and there is very, very little moisture there. The humidity in the desert is very, very low. So many things have been preserved perfectly in Egyptian tombs. And of course, as soon as you get them out of the tombs and put them in museums, that's when the trouble starts. So we could preserve things forever if we kept them in zero humidity, with zero light and zero oxygen and zero people looking at them. But because we're a museum, we exist for people, so that people can interact with things. So we do need to be very pragmatic. I thought it would be useful also to consider what it is that we are caring for here. So our permanent collection consists of about 9,000 items. A very high proportion of those is on display. In most museums, it's really just a tiny fraction of the whole collection that is on display, but here it is unusually high. It's getting on for a quarter of the collection, which is out in the galleries. The rest, as I'm sure you know, is in the 4 stores in the basement. And we also have a few things which are out on loan to other institutions. So we've got things on loan, for instance, to No. 1 Royal Crescent, to Herschel's House, National Trust, and various other generally local institutions. Because so much of the collection is on display, means that a lot of it is vulnerable through exposure to all sorts of risks. Things are much safer locked away. So the people who are responsible for looking after the permanent collection are the curators, which this week is just me on my own. The collection could not be preserved without one vital thing, and that's the building. We have to look after our building, not just because it's a Grade 1 listed building, it's an important piece of Bath's heritage, we have a duty of care towards it, but also because it's the box that we keep our stuff in. It protects the objects inside it. And the person responsible for looking after that primarily is our facilities manager, Steve Kendall. We also have to look after other people's stuff. So we have loans to the permanent collection, things like the wonderful Zophany that came last August. The way that we protect those is by having firm agreements with our lenders. And we make promises to the lenders that we will look after their things in certain particular ways. And they will sign up to that and say, yes, we're happy with what you're proposing. We also obviously insure anything that isn't ours, so that if any damage does occur, we can at least compensate the owner financially. Again, the person who has to look after all that is the curators. But we also have other people's stuff that comes to exhibitions. So there's a view from the Presence exhibition. couple of years ago. For that, again, we have loan agreements, and very often in these cases it will be the lender who sends us a huge wad of papers saying, thou shalt not this and thou shalt not that, and you have to tell us about this, and if anything happens you need to ring us up, and we want to send our courier and we want them to spend the weekend in Bath, and you need to give them money so they can go shopping in Bath. I exaggerate slightly, but the lender can dictate their terms because it's their stuff, and they are quite rightly concerned that we look after their things. And so we will have an agreement with them. We also make sure that anything that comes to an exhibition is thoroughly checked so that we know the condition it's in at the point of arrival, and if anything happens to it, we can prove whether or not that damage has occurred while the object has been here. And again, we use insurance. I'll say a little more about that at the end. But the person who looks after those, of course, is Howard, our exhibitions officer. The other thing, of course, that we must look after is our people. Our visitors, like this man who's having a lovely time. Our staff, and you, our volunteers. And that's where you come in, is looking after people as much as the objects. So I just thought it would be interesting to have a look at who exactly is responsible for the care of collections. Well, this is a diagram of the staff at the museum. Ultimately, the care of the collections is the responsibility of the trustees, who are so high up that they don't even appear on the diagram. There's our lovely chairman, Richard Fleck. Then, of course, the director will have the overriding responsibility. The curators, again, just me at the moment, we're the people who actually do the looking after of the stuff and any decisions surrounding that. There's Steve, facilities manager, who looks after the building, and by looking after the building and all the systems in it, the air conditioning systems and the lighting and so on, he has a huge impact on the welfare of our collections. Of course, Spencer and our duty managers are equally important in the day-to-day looking after the collection. And finally, our volunteers, because you're like the front line for all of this. So what can go wrong? How can things be damaged? There are many different ways in which an object can deteriorate. The most obvious and dangerous one is in a way the one whose risk is one of the lowest here. So, fire. This is the fire at Up Park. I don't know whether you remember, I think it happened, when was it? Late 80s? Late 80s, in this wonderful National Trust house on the Sussex Downs, far away from any public source of water, caught fire accidentally, as so often happens. It's because a contractor isn't being careful enough, isn't following the right health and safety, making sure that everything is switched off. And as you know, the entire house was gutted. Some of the contents were saved, and thanks to the insurance payout, the whole house has now been restored. Windsor Castle, of course, the other great historic building to have a major disaster, exactly the same reason, careless contractors. Closely related to fire is flood, and I don't think that our risk here of sort of rivers swirling and bursting their banks and rushing down towards us and pouring in, I don't think that's going to be a risk here. What is a risk is, well, as you know, we do have floods here because we see it every winter when the garden gradually fills up and those spaces out here and round the back, they turn into a sort of paddy field and puddles. That is a potential danger for us because that can come through into the basement. The other big risk is from water coming in from above. And we did actually have, I think it was just before Christmas, we did have a flood, very small one, but I think it was the day after we'd all broken up for Christmas. And I had a phone call to say that there was water dripping into the Roper Gallery, the most sensitive area in the whole museum. And there was water dripping in. And we found out that all that had happened, very simple, was that there were leaves clogging the drain on the roof, and that had overflowed, and the water had found its way into the gallery. That was very quickly solved. But those are the kind of things that could very, very easily cause damage. As it happened, there weren't any objects directly underneath the drips, but there could so easily have been. So, how do we monitor these things? Well, we have our alarm systems, we have our fire drills. Were some of you here when we did the fire drill just before Christmas? It was very, very interesting, and we learned a lot from it, so I'm sure we'll be doing some more to make sure we've got it right next time. We have all sorts of detectors, we have our fire extinguishers, we have an emergency plan as well, which can be implemented depending on the severity of the accident. But I think the most important thing to remember in the case of a fire or any disaster like that is you don't need to worry about the collection at all. Your responsibility is to the people around you. And I may say this several times during the course of the evening, there is no work of art in the world, not even the Mona Lisa, which is more valuable than a human life. So never ever put anybody at risk. The next horrible thing that can happen, which again is a low risk here, is theft. Theft which goes together with vandalism and malicious damage. We covered this in the session that we had in 2012, but I'd say the most important thing about theft, and one that worries me, beware distractions. Very often, people who are coming to steal something will set up some kind of a distraction, so they'll get somebody to make trouble in one corner of the museum, so all the attention is there, while their accomplices can go in quietly somewhere else and help themselves to things. So do be aware of that, and just think a bit if something odd is happening. Vandalism is much scarier, I think, because it's so often done not by people who are trying to take something so that they can make money or something out of it, but people who are slightly mad. And just to give you some examples, this Poussin, the adoration of the golden calf at the National Gallery, was spray painted not long ago. It was last July, July 2011 it was. This happened at 5 p.m. That's your danger point. At 5 p.m. the museum is about to close, everybody's packing up to go home. That's when things so often go wrong and people take their opportunity. Just to give you a very famous one, the Rokeby Venus in the National Gallery. Again, the National Gallery is very, very vulnerable because it is the National Gallery. This was a high-profile picture at the time because it had recently been bought for the nation. It was one of the first major purchases of the National Art Collections Fund. And it was attacked by a suffragette, this lady, Mary Richardson, in 1914. And she didn't attack the picture because it offended her, but because she was making a political point. She was trying to get publicity for Mrs. Pankhurst, who was in prison. She was being treated extremely badly. And she said, "I have tried to destroy the picture of the most beautiful woman in mythological history, as a protest against the government for destroying Mrs. Pankhurst, who is the most beautiful character in modern history. That's unlikely, I hope, to happen here. It might happen if we were borrowing something from a high-profile institution or a high-profile lender. But you can get malicious damage happening. You can even get people doing really careless and stupid things. So in Detroit in 2006, a boy stuck his chewing gum to a painting. That can do a lot of damage, and it's impossible to prevent something like that. I have seen malicious damage. This Lancia at Kenwood, you see where the X is there. What happened was this was hanging in a rather out-of-the-way place. It was sort of hanging under the stairs in a lobby that wasn't stewarded. And a couple came in, and somebody had upset them about something. I don't know, they had an argument with one of the custodians or something like that, and they were cross. They wandered into this lobby, and one of them took out a pencil and stabbed the picture. And again, that had to be taken off display. We were lucky at English Heritage because we had our own internal team of conservators, but still it was off display for a long time. That's permanent damage. It can be repaired, but obviously Lancia's original work was damaged. This was a weird one. Again, this was hanging in an area here that wasn't stewarded, and this is before anybody here's time. Nice landscape by Benjamin Barker. And if you look closely at this boy here, you see he's got a little hat on. That was just added by somebody. Why not give him a little hat? And things like that do happen, surprisingly. So you can't be too observant. You need to be really alert, particularly at those times when you think, oh, it's quiet, nothing's happening. Accidental damage. Again, this is so difficult because accidents are accidents, and all we can do is try to minimise risks. You've all read or heard about those vases at the Fitzwilliam Museum. This was not long ago when that poor man tumbled down the stairs and crashed into these Qing dynasty vases, 5 of them on that windowsill, one after the other, like dominoes. It took 3 days for these conservators in their white coats and their gloves to pick up all the bits, put them in boxes. They were all numbered, and 7 months for the conservators to put them back together. It was a huge publicity opportunity, and it was an interesting thing for people to read about because it made people think about how vulnerable objects are, and also to admire the extraordinary skill of people who can do this kind of work, and to understand why this kind of thing is so expensive as well. It's very, very skilled work, and it really isn't cheap. Here we have had accidental damage, and it's been quite recent as well, and I do worry about this, and I know that a lot of you do as well. The ale house by someone like Teniers. This is it's in a bit of a corner, isn't it, upstairs? But these scratches appeared on that. Thankfully, they're only varnish deep, so they can be made to disappear by revarnishing. And then a scratch also appeared on Mr. Byam's leg. That's that white stuff there, that's his stocking. This scratch was deeper, and there's still a little bit of an indentation. And this kind of thing, that's it repaired. But there's still a little bit of a scar, and this kind of thing is very, very worrying, particularly when the picture doesn't belong to us. And the owner wasn't particularly happy. He's not taken it away, thank goodness. but we do need to be so vigilant about this kind of thing. We do have a procedure in place for reporting accidents, but if you spot anything unusual, just let us know. If you've got a phone, take a photo of it, or just point it out to the duty manager. And it's useful to know, even if you didn't see what happened, it's just useful to know when something has first been spotted. So what can we do to prevent this kind of thing? Please do everything you can to discourage people from taking rucksacks upstairs. We have thrown out all our clipboards, which some had very sharp metal edges, so we've thrown all those out and we've got nice plastic ones instead. We have a policy for schools and similar groups about what materials they can use in the gallery, because we used to have huge rows with the education department when they did things with glitter and broccoli and bits of pasta, and they flew all over the gallery. So that now is much, much better controlled. We also have a policy for artists who want to copy paintings. If somebody wants to come in and copy one of the pictures in watercolour, even oils, we have ways of managing that. And most importantly, the way that we manage events, because that's when the rooms are crowded and that's when things can go wrong. One of the greatest causes of deterioration is when the temperature and relative humidity are incorrect. This is the sciencey bit. So, temperature. Temperature and humidity are very closely linked because, as you know, temperature affects humidity. So if you heat something up, it dries out, and if you cool it down, it gets damp. To explain the physics behind that, we measure relative humidity. And what that means is it's basically the amount of water that a volume of air can contain at a particular temperature. So at any given temperature, a certain amount of water can become vapour in a volume of air. If that amount of water vapour is present in that volume of air, that means that the air is saturated. So that's what we would call 100% relative humidity. 100% relative humidity is saturation point. But that varies according to the temperature. 50% relative humidity would be if only half of the water vapour is present that could potentially be held by that volume of air. Okay, does that make sense? If the relative humidity exceeds 100%, then that volume of air loses its capacity to hold and to manage all that moisture, and it begins to drop out as condensation. That's when you get serious problems. But even at high relative humidities, you can get problems, and also at low relative humidities, you can get problems. And just to complicate things, different materials respond in different ways. So some materials, like a dry atmosphere, so metals, for instance, they don't like any damp at all because it can make them corrode and rust, whereas other things like to be nice and moist so that they don't dry out. So as the temperature rises, the relative humidity falls. When that happens, things dry out, they hold less moisture, and so they shrink. As the temperature falls, the relative humidity rises, so things get damp. They hold more moisture, and so they expand. So heat and cold per se aren't so much a problem as the way that they affect the relative humidity. And we have all sorts of ways of overcoming that. But if it's too cold, things might freeze, they might crack, particularly if they're particularly inflexible things like ceramics and glass. They may well crack if it gets too cold. If it gets too hot, you can get chemical reactions beginning to happen. You can get moulds beginning to appear. If it's an inorganic material, say a metal, then it expands. So it could, if you've got something that, say, is partially made of metal and partially made of wood, and it's getting hot, you can imagine that the metal is expanding, the wood is shrinking because the moisture's coming out of it, and so the two part company. If it's too dry, it's a real problem for organic things because they dry out, they weaken, they can split. If they're held together with adhesives, the adhesives can dry out, the bits fall apart. If it's too damp, you can get mould on organic things, or you can get corrosion on metals. If you get condensation, it can discolour things, it can spoil the surface of things, things can be deformed, things might even dissolve. So if you've got soluble substance like pigments or varnishes, they can dissolve in damp. So you may have seen paintings which have a sort of opaque bloom on them. That's because the varnish has got damp at some point, and it never goes back to how it was, and you can't see through it anymore. Also, if it's too damp, a lot of pests will like that because it means that it's easier to chew or burrow through things. But the worst problem is when you get rapid changes in relative humidity, because different things expand and contract at different rates. And if you have something that expands and contracts too many times, too often, if you think of a credit card, if you bend that, you bend it once, it's not a problem. But if you keep bending and bending and bending, what happens? It snaps. So if the humidity is just changing very gradually, that's fine because the object will just gently change shape. But if it happens suddenly, and then suddenly again, say several times a day or over several different days, you may well find that that's when things get put under immense pressure and they can snap and crack and things can flake, and that's the thing that we really, really worry about and that we really don't want to happen. The Whitcomb cabinet is one example of a victim of this, and I haven't been able to find any photographs in Matthew's filing system. I haven't been able to find any photographs of the damage to this, but you can go and see it for yourselves. How one of the doors, I think this one, the veneer has split very, very badly and quite recently, and we're pretty sure that that is to do with the environment, with changes in humidity. Probably here, we think it's happened since this piece of furniture has moved here, and we're doing what we can to keep that environment stable. So that's why we have that little humidifier sitting there on the floor next to the cabinet, chugging away, just to keep the air nice and moist, because it can really dry out. You know, it gets very hot up there on the mezzanine, doesn't it? It gets very hot, it can get very dry, and a lot of that is to do with a big bogeyman of mine called solar gain. Solar gain is a kind of technical term for what you might call greenhouse effect. You've all sat in people's conservatories or even in people's sitting rooms when the sun is beating through the windows and you are getting warmer and warmer and warmer. You close the curtains and it's much easier. This is a problem here because it was like this in this room. Particularly in the afternoons, we get that very, very intense western sun that shines. It's sort of funneled down Great Pulteney Street, and it all comes in through these windows and the windows above in the ballroom. And a few weeks ago, something very scary happened to me. I got some of the watercolours from the Somerset Maugham collection out, and I put them out here on the tables to show them to some students from Bristol who are working on them. They're preparing the exhibition for June, July. And I left them on the tables, and I came back a few minutes later, literally about a quarter of an hour later. The sun was pouring through that window there, and that is what had happened to poor Mrs. Bland. Do you see what's happened to her there? She's curved right round, and that was in that very short space of time. And it was jolly silly of me to have done that, to leave them out in the sun. But it shows you the sort of damage that can occur. Fortunately, that is something that will flatten down over time, and if we just put a bit of gentle weight on it, then that will settle down. But you do need to be so careful. Very often we don't realise how hot things are getting in the sunshine. Now, the recommended ideal of relative humidity is 40 to 65%. And it's recommended that that isn't permitted to fluctuate more than 10% within 24 hours. The temperature should be between 16 and 24 degrees centigrade. We try to keep it well above 16 because that's really quite chilly for people. So it does need very careful controlling. And the most important thing if you're going to do that is to monitor what's going on. So to monitor our temperature and relative humidity, we use these little chaps. This is a tiny tag. You've all seen these hiding in corners. And these are collected up in a basket every Monday morning. And they are taken down to our office. And the data off these is uploaded onto a computer every week. And it gives us readings that look something like this. This is the chart for the past week. So this was uploaded this morning from the picture gallery. And if you look at this, the blue line, that's humidity, blue for wet and red for hot. Do you notice there's a peak? You see that the peak there at this point. That peak happened about sort of 8 o'clock in the evening on Friday. Was anybody here then? Know what happened? Yeah, there was a lovely concert. Yes. So that's what happens. All these people sitting there having a lovely time make the temperature go up by about, it's not too severe, it's nothing to worry about, it's actually only 1 or 2 degrees, but it shows you the difference that it makes. As you can see, this room is very actively controlled by the systems we have there. It's going up and down an awful lot. That's not actually ideal because it's showing us that the system is very busy, it's working very, very hard, and that costs a lot in energy. We can't keep the entire museum like Pharaoh's tomb, like the strong room. So I think I got these in the wrong order, but I'll tell you about this first of all. Does anyone know what this is? What kind? What kind? Where does it come from? Which part of the world? Is it a polar? You think it might be a polar one? Because it's white. Is it though? It's a polecat, but it's brown. That's its natural colour. It's actually 2 colours, and that's because it's been on display in broad daylight for years, and it's completely lost the colour of its coat on one side, and it's turned into an Arctic ermine, which it wasn't supposed to be at all. This is what light is. It's a very small bit. This is the visible spectrum, okay, that little rainbow bit there, which has been expanded out here. Basically, this is radiation. This is all the different kinds of radiation, and visible light comes about in the middle. So you've got everything from cosmic rays, gamma rays, X-rays, microwaves. Note microwaves. Visible light and microwaves are very closely related, and if you speed up the rate of visible light, you get the effect of microwaves. So basically what's happening is that anything exposed to light, not just natural daylight, but artificial light as well, anything exposed to light is being very, very, very slowly microwaved. And the same goes for you as well. We all know the effect of light on our skins, particularly this nasty here, UV light. Ultraviolet light is useless for seeing by. It's very useful, of course, for making things grow and so on. But we can actually screen it out. And we do that by using lamps that don't generate UV. We put plastic films on the windows so that the UV doesn't come through, because it's incredibly damaging. As you know what it does to your skin. Basically, it breaks down proteins. And because it's at this end of the spectrum, it's the nastiest one of the lot, and it breaks things down fastest. The most sensitive objects to this kind of damage are the organic things, particularly textiles, watercolours, miniatures, anything like that. So we have to be really strict about the amount of light that we expose them to. So oil paintings and things like that, we try to display them at 200 lux or below. Ceramics are very light insensitive. They're basically rocks. They're reformed rocks. So they can put up with a lot of light, hence why we put them up on the mezzanine. But oil paintings can't really cope with more than 200 lux. That's what we measure light in. And watercolours and textiles and things, they need to stay below 50. The way that we monitor our light, we have two ways. As you know, we monitor it manually every day. We have a team of volunteers that goes around with the light meter and notes it down. Those notes are then transcribed into a spreadsheet so that we have a permanent record of how the light has been behaving around the building. We also have these little chaps. You might recognise these from around the place. These are lux bugs. And we can download, again, every Monday morning, we download the data from these, and they tell us how the light has been behaving in particularly sensitive areas. One of the ways to protect things that are particularly sensitive to extremes of light is to put them away. And we have some things that we have put away. We've put, the Jagger portrait of William Holborn in the green coat. That's gone away. We've replaced it with a different drawing, so we'll swap them round. Turner also has been off display for quite some time, but it is coming back early next year. We're going to send it to Bristol Museum soon for a little touring exhibition about Turner, which we've put together with them. And this will go to Bristol, Swindon, Cheltenham, and here as well. So you'll see this briefly next year. The British Museum has a policy of putting things away in the dark for 3 years for every 1 year that they're displayed. And that seems a good policy to me. I'm not sure how long we can keep it up, because I know that people do love the Turner and it is very much in demand. We have lights in some areas that only come on when visitors are present, so where the miniatures and the embroideries are, for instance, they're our most sensitive objects. We cut out all the UV, as I mentioned. We have our automatic blinds in the picture gallery and also the manual blinds in the ballroom. As I said, that light that comes through from the west in the evenings and afternoons is very, very intense. We measured the light coming through this window at about this point last Friday, 3:15 in the afternoon. So I told you that the maximum for an oil painting is 200 lux. The level that we measured at this point here with the shutter open, 52,000 lux. Incredibly strong. The sort of light that if you put your hand you would feel the heat of it. So it can be very, very strong and very, very damaging at certain points in the day. Another scary threat, pests. Pests come in all shapes and sizes. They can be tiny microscopic things like mould. They can be big fat things like rats. Mould is a real horror because it spreads so quickly, it grows so quickly, and it's so difficult to control because it flies around. So it's something that we're always very, very wary about. And that if you do spot anything, any funny smells or anything like that, do think about whether there might be. I mean, our building I don't think is damp enough that it should be a problem. The greatest danger to us is bringing in mould from outside. There are all sorts of horrid invertebrates that can be a problem. We're fortunate because this building is quite new. So all the things that were living here ran away when the builders came. And a lot of them haven't had a chance to come back and build up yet. The things that we really want to watch out for are the things that eat animal proteins. Like this chap here, I'm sure you all know him. There's the carpet beetle. Here, that's the carpet beetle, and that's her dear little baby. I should have warned you to look away. Look away if you're squeamish about these things. That's her little baby, Woolly Bear, who gnaws his way through wool and silk, things like that. This one is a real monster. This is the Dermestes maculatus, and he is also known as a hide beetle. He eats leather, fur, skin, feathers. He's not too much of a threat in this museum. But I'm going to pass this round. This is my great-grandfather's shoehorn, and I put it in my wardrobe, which has been built very cleverly. It's been built over a fireplace, which leads up the chimney to a place where birds nest. And bird nests are riddled with dermestids because they eat all the spare bits of feathers and stuff. When the birds leave, they've got no more feathers to eat, so they make their way down the chimney and see what they can find in people's cupboards. This is my shoehorn. It's a real horn from a little goat or something. They love this stuff, and you can see how this little chap, not the grown-ups are harmless, but the larvae have gnawed their way through this hard piece of horn. So pass that round and be very afraid. If that happens here, then we could be in real trouble. The other little horror that you all know as well is very prettily named. It's the Tineola biselliella. There she is. Very pretty clothes moth. Again, she doesn't do any harm herself. It's her babies that burrow through things, and I'm sure you have all had face-to-face contact with her. We actually do have quite a lot of these flitting around at the moment, and I think we're going to order some traps for them because we haven't just seen one. We're beginning to see quite a few. So if you do spot them, let us know. You know what to look for. They're little golden shiny things. What else? There are things that eat plants as well, particularly wood borers. They can be a real nuisance. You all know about deathwatch beetles, woodworm or furniture beetles as they're more properly known, book lice, silverfish, all of the things that gnaw at plant materials. Silverfish are potentially a huge danger to our books and works on paper. Wood borers aren't too much to worry about nowadays because they tend to live in cold, damp places, and most places now are heated such that it's sort of too warm and dry for them. But if, again, you spot any little black things on windowsills, they may well, because they fly towards the light. So the adults always fly towards the light looking for mates at this time of year. If you spot anything, don't squash it flat because then we won't be able to recognise it. But be interesting for us just to check that it's not anything harmful. Rats and mice, of course, things that chew things, they're a great risk. And also things that make a mess. Pigeons and gulls, things that make messes and that can attract other pests. So I told you about the nest on my roof, and just passing that round so everyone can see. How do we monitor for pests? Well, this is quite fun. We have these traps and we put these around the building, and we check these every month to see who has crawled onto it. And our bug traps are surprisingly clean and clear because, as I said, it's a stone building, it's a new building. We don't actually have that much that attracts them. We don't have lots of curtains and wall hangings and things. There's a tiny little fly there, but most of what you see here is actually something that worries me more. It's grit, and it comes in from the car park, and there's an awful lot of it in this building. I'll talk more about it in a minute. First, just how we control pests. The main thing is housekeeping, keeping the place spotlessly clean, being scrupulous about things like how we deal with our rubbish, how we deal with food remnants. I know that lots of visitors come and give you banana skins and stuff to put in the bins, so we're going to make sure that those bins get emptied daily and we don't have horrible food remains in the building. Please, if you see anybody who's chomping crisps or drinking a milkshake or something, making their way up the stairs, make sure they put them away before they enter the galleries. Again, we keep windows and doors closed. We avoid bringing cut flowers into the building. There are certain kinds of cut flowers, and particularly also plants in soil that are potentially dangerous. And we avoid damp conditions where these things can breed. Let's get on to the contamination bit now. This is one of the other risks of deterioration. Anything that comes into contact with an object that isn't part of an object can be considered a contaminant. So we have solid things, things like what the object sits on, display materials, display cases. We need to be careful about what they're made of. Gases and airborne things, pollution from traffic and dust, and to some extent people as well. These things can cause chemical reactions, they can cause discoloration, they might coat things, and dust causes abrasion. It can be scratchy, and particularly that grit that I showed you from the car park. We try to control that by putting mats down, but you see how quickly it sort of coats everything, so that is a real nuisance. We're careful about the materials that we use. Again, we try to keep the building as clean as possible to reduce dust. We're looking for more conservation cleaners, by the way, people who can dust the objects on open display and who can help us to clean our display cases regularly. So if you're interested in that, do please let us know. But above all, we ask that people don't touch things, because one of the worst contaminants is people's hands, which are full of horrible chemicals and can be surprisingly damaging. Your sweat is quite corrosive, and some people's is much more corrosive than others. Some people are quite acidic. I know I am. I try not to touch things because I know that I do damage things because I'm so acidic. I try not to eat too much vinegar. But your hands are moist, so they put moisture onto things. They're greasy, so they put lumps of grease on things. All of these things can attract pests. They can attract mold. So that's why when we handle things, we wear gloves, and why we ask visitors, please, not to touch things. And that goes for you as well. Please, if you have any reason why you do need to handle something, talk to us first. But otherwise, please avoid touching anything in the collection. Movement can also cause all sorts of risks. Wear and tear. If you can't, I'll read that out for you. Actually, sir, says the ticket man, actually, sir, it wasn't a ruin until we opened it up to the public. If you pick something up, you could pick it up by the wrong bit. Often a handle is the weakest part of an object. or the part where two different materials come together. If you imagine something that's perhaps like a portrait miniature with a metal frame and a glass thing, often the metal frame will pop off and you'll have the glass and the miniature and they'll all collapse in your hands. So you need to know how to handle things. You can pull things apart if you put the wrong sort of pressure on them. Things can get abraded by just wear, by handling over time. Vibration also can be a problem. If you plonk something down too hard, it can be shaken to bits. Not understanding an object can be very, very risky. I'll give you an example. These beautiful Robert Adam tables in the library at Kenwood. What do you think the tops are made of? They look like sheets of marble, don't they? Well, that's what I thought. We had to move these tables because they wanted to install some alarms in the windows. So I got these guys together and I said, right, let's move these tables. We need to take the tops off first, and then we can move the wooden carcass. What I hadn't realised was that the tops aren't made of solid marble. They're actually marble veneer. It's dozens of small little bits of marble set into plaster. So it's like a piece of Kendal mint cake. And we pushed them up from underneath. And it was literally like a slab of Kendal mint cake. It crumbled just like that. It's one of the most terrifying things that's ever happened to me. And that was because I hadn't done my homework and found out what these things were actually made of. But as you can see, this is a photo from just the other day when they reopened. They're fine now, I'm glad to say. So it's really important that you use professionals who know what they're doing. What about things that belong to somebody else? Well, I've spoken a little bit about loans, but I wanted to mention how things work in the Roper Gallery because, as you know, we have much stricter controls in there. And that's because generally everything in the Roper Gallery belongs to other people. It often belongs to museums that are more important than us, so we've really got to keep our nose clean. Also because we use, in that area, the government indemnity scheme. So for things that have been lent to us, rather than have us fork out thousands and thousands of pounds for insurance, the government will very kindly take on the risk. But in return for that, they ask that we are extremely strict in how we look after the things. That's why we're so strict about stewarding in the Roper Gallery. The temperature and humidity are very, very well controlled in there. The light, as you know, is extremely well controlled by the louvres. The big window at the end of the gallery that overlooks the garden is almost always blocked out. You've probably even forgotten that it's there. We never have events in there. And the installation is always done by professionals. It's extremely well managed by Howard. And it would be wonderful if we could look after the rest of the museum as well, but obviously in other areas we do have to compromise and perhaps not look after our own things quite to the same standard. I just wanted to flag up a few situations of particular risk. Obviously when you've got groups, you've got big numbers of people coming in, particularly if they're especially young people. When they come in, they're excited, it's all new. They're not aware of their surroundings. They may not have been particularly well briefed about how we behave in museums. And they can, rarely, but they can sometimes be naughty. And by naughty, I mean they can deliberately try things on. And I saw some children not long ago come into the gallery. They were part of a group. They came into the picture gallery, and the first thing they did, they headed straight for the flora, and they put their hands all over it on purpose. And they were looking at their grown-ups with those faces that say, what are you going to do about it? And I was very, very, very cross indeed. I didn't say anything at that moment to the children. It's always difficult to know what to do. Do you talk to the child or talk to the grown-up? And I know it's really difficult these days. The flora is really vulnerable. This is something that happened recently. See little toe? She's having an operation to have her toe stuck back on. So it is extremely vulnerable. So do watch it like a hawk. It needn't be groups of little people. It could be older people as well who come in groups. Often, you know, they come on a tour and it's getting a bit boring and they're getting a bit tired from standing and they lean on things without thinking. Very often I see people just discreetly leaning backwards into the shants. Older people, of course, often their balance might not be great, their eyesight might not be great, and they can be naughty too sometimes. Obviously, concerts and lectures, when the gallery is crowded, they can be risky. You've seen the effect that they have on the temperature. The most important there is please make sure people don't get out of their seats on the wrong side of the aisle. Those barriers are there for a reason. And we always try to make them sort of impenetrable. But occasionally there are naughty people who are sitting on the inside of the gallery and they'll get out of their chair and walk along the barriered area, which is absolutely terrifying. So we need to do whatever we can to prevent that. But as I say, grown-ups can be naughty too. Dinners, of course, incredibly risky. At events, these sort of social events, something like this isn't too bad because we know all of these people, their staff and trustees and various guests. I forget what the occasion was. I think it was David Posnett's leaving party or something like that. So these are all fairly trustworthy people. It's not the sort of thing where people are going to get blind drunk. But it's things like the weddings that you really want to watch out for. We don't know the people and we can't predict how they're going to behave. When people come to parties, they do behave differently. I'm not saying that they will behave badly, but you just have a different mindset from if you're visiting a museum. Things can very easily go wrong, and this is a spectacular example from a gallery in Switzerland, in Lugano, which happened last year. Work by a very important Italian avant-garde artist called Luciano Fabbro, and this work is called Impronta. It's a piece of glass about this big with a print inside it. It's priceless, very precious thing. And it was on the floor. It was displayed on the floor in this gallery. They had an opening, a private view. They're very, very important in Italy. They invite, the mayor and all the journalists. And a journalist managed to walk into it. And that's what happened. Whoops. So the risk of people tripping into things, risk of things spilling if people are eating canapes, for instance. You remember those tables that I showed you at Kenwood? I once had the Crown Prince of the Asturias sitting on one of those tables. And you can't say to a Crown Prince, "Oi, get off that table." But my worry was that he'd fall through, because I knew by that time that it wasn't made of solid marble. Obviously, in Madrid, their tables are made of solid marble. So these sort of events can be worrying, but we can manage them. We have strict procedures in place, and all of these sort of things can be managed and the risks reduced as far as we possibly can. You do need, though, to watch out for the quiet times, because they're the times when maybe you're off your guard, and that's when things like theft, vandalism, those kind of things can most easily happen. You can be caught unawares. But I think that's probably as much as you need to know. It's a lot to take in, but if you would like to follow up any of those things, you can always ask, and I can give you an idea of where to look for further information. One thing I would recommend is the National Trust Manual of Housekeeping. It's enormous. It's about that thick and very, very heavy. But it's a fascinating book. It tells you about all sorts of different materials, and it's quite helpful for you as well in giving you little tips about how to look after your own things at home. So there we are. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
I've been, in the short time I've been here, I'm kind of quite amazed by how people put their fingers right up close to a painting. Really close, like within an inch. And I've had to go up and polite say, please give me like your heads further away. But I don't know, I'm just astounded by how they do that.
They do, because people are enjoying themselves.
Exactly.
And that's why you're there, really, is to say to them politely, to make them aware of something that they're not aware of. And very often it's simply that people aren't thinking. So you need just to say, don't forget.
You need to trick.
Yeah. Rosemary.
Following on from that, can I ask how you decide whether a picture should be glazed or not? Some are.
Yes, we try not to, because it's expensive. It can damage the picture in other ways, and it doesn't always look great. The types of non-reflective glass are getting better and better and better, but we try not to do it here. Some museums have a policy that they just glaze everything, and it looks dreadful. But at the moment we're not doing it here. There may be some cases where we need to reconsider, but I hope we can be a museum that, trusts its visitors. And,
So that will damage the protection?
No, it doesn't. But, it means you have to take the thing apart and change the way that the frame works. You have to do a bit of carpentry. So it's not straightforward. Did I see a... Yes.
Amina, given that the car park is upsetting visitors, you also upset visitors who said to me, oh, don't come to don't go there anymore, because you go in their car park and your carpets are completely covered. Yeah. Are we actually
Thinking. And it's to do with so many complicated things, like, it's to do with the car park needs to look a particular way, which is to do with planning and listing and so on. So it's not straightforward, but yeah, definitely thinking, because it is giving rise to a lot of problems, and it's costing so much to fill the holes all the time. Yeah. Lisa.
What's the policy of young mums being pushed to a feeding?
Oh, that's difficult. That's really difficult.
I had that situation.
Yeah. It slightly depends what's in the bottle. Milk's fine. I think you can't stop a baby drinking milk, can you? Yeah. We did once have a toddler with a carton of Ribena, and the dear little chap wasn't drinking his Ribena, he was just sitting with the carton and squeezing it gently. And we had a trail of Ribena all through the hall and all over the place. We had little black dots of Ribena, and it never goes out because it stains and it's black. That's why we don't have red wine for functions. So if it is Ribena or red wine, then I think you need to be very polite as you possibly can. You might have to judge the parent and see what sort of a parent it's going to be, but it is difficult. But in the end, people are guests in the museum. It's not a public building in the sense that a railway station is. They are guests here. Anyone else? Sorry, Jane, yeah.
When you do see children, what do you say to them if you think they expect such a thing, that kids put their hands on their head? Do you tell them or do you tell the parents?
I think it really depends. It really depends on the situation, doesn't it? Where the parents are in relation to the child. You do have to be really, really careful.
I've noticed with you know, the tutors and the chairs.
Yeah.
If I can move them and sit on the chairs, then
Oh, for heaven's
that's quite
sake.
difficult as well.
Yeah. Is it that children or grown-ups that do
Children,
that?
usually.
Yeah.
I mean, I have had adults say, what are those trying to sit on the chair?
Yes.
But, I don't seem to realise.
I think then what you have to do is to point out that it's not just the safety of the collection, it's for their safety.
Yeah.
So if you sit on that, it's very old and you might hurt yourself.
Yeah.
And put it that way rather
Yeah.
than
That's
you're
what I
naughty, but you know. So it is very, very difficult, and yeah, particularly nowadays when I know that every generation has said children don't know how to behave anymore, but it's the parents who don't know.
Because I'm always scared of, well, you know, because you're walking backwards to the attention.
But you know, relax. You don't. I say be vigilant, but you know, if you're too uptight, then you'll have a miserable time, and that's not why you're here.
So thank you, Amina. I think we have a better understanding now that what we have to do day in, day out, and all things to worry about from now on. So thank you, Amina, and just to remind you that the next lecture in the series is the 25th of April, which is by Zara, and it's about history, museum, and buildings, so that's really important. So thank you again, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. Where did we stop this thing now? All of this is like lady.